My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we drag into the light a monstrous secret long veiled from view. The Secret of Castronegro.
Our first segment is Basic Crawl. The Secret of Castronegro is a 13.5-page adventure set in 1920s New Mexico, written for Call of Cthulhu by Mark Pettigrew and Sandy Peterson, with art by Chris Marinan. It appears in the Cthulhu Companion, published in 1983 and incorporated into the 3rd edition rulebook in 1986, and in Cthulhu Classics in 1989. Now, fair warning, as a general matter, this podcast pays no regard to spoilers. We are a spoiler podcast. But the following overview of the scenario, it's particularly spoilery, okay? So just know that before listening. The book begins with a keeper intro that gives background not on the mystery itself, but on the town of Castronegro and the Diaz family who founded it and reside there still in the 1920s. A newspaper clipping is the plot hook for the investigators. 3 people are named missing. Joaquin Villela Perea, a young man from Castronegro, Dr. William Godfrey, a noted psychology professor, and David Lane, a traveler from Boston. Shall we read that newspaper clipping, Tom?
Oh, sure, yeah, I can give it a go in my best newsreel announcer voice if you want.
Please do.
Yeah. Weird disappearances baffle sheriff. I can't keep doing this. I'll just read it normally.
Oh man, I really want to hear it the whole way that way. Okay.
No, I can't. No. The police of southwest New Mexico have been mystified by a string of evidently unrelated missing person cases. On September 28th, Joaquin Villela Pereira, a native of the small town of Castronegro, was discovered to have left his room at the Armitage Hotel in Silver City, leaving all his possessions behind. The authorities suspect foul play, but have no suspects or clues. This would not be so surprising were it not for 2 previous disappearances. On September 16th, Dr. William Godfrey, a noted professor of psychology at the University of New Mexico at Albuquerque, was reported missing while traveling from Silver City to Las Cruces. On the 18th, the traveler from Boston, a Mr. David Lane, was found missing from his rented room in downtown Silver City. Both of these disappearances are also unaccounted for, though the police suspect that there is some connection between them.
Indeed, throughout the text, there are newspaper clippings like this that kind of provide some backstory to what's going on in the mystery, as well as some flavor, including a newspaper clipping about a cattle mutilation that we think is kind of a red herring, right?
Yeah, mostly goes nowhere. But then to pursue the investigation, before getting to the town of Castronegro itself, there are things the investigators can be doing. So a visit to Dr. Godfrey's home in Albuquerque finds in his bedroom a book bought at a place called The Tomb, which will turn out to be the occult bookshop in Castronegro. Visiting David Lane's rented room in Silver City, you can find out that he was in touch with the parish priest in Castronegro, a Father Villela Pereira, the same surname as the missing Joaquin. And as for Joaquin himself, his kidnapping is fairly straightforward, but it introduces the recurring clue of footprints from heavy boots with a cross imprint in the heel. And then 2 short sections follow on researching the town of Castronegro. You get some mysterious tales from history and a little bit about those cattle mutilations, which, don't really go anywhere. So, page 4 of the scenario is the section Arriving in Castronegro, and this is where the action proper begins. As you arrive in the town, assuming you arrive by bus, the garrulous bus driver helpfully points out the key locations you'll need to investigate and visit. There is the town's hotel, the Tomb bookshop, owned by a Diaz, although I altered this when I ran it most recently to be run by his wife to kind of point out the connection of there are 2 or 3 kind of long-lasting clans in the town, and also to have any women at all as NPCs in the town.
It is a dude-heavy scenario, for sure.
It really is. I think I might have done that with the librarian as well, actually. Anyway, there's also the parish church in the middle of the town. There is a speakeasy, a library, a tobacco shop owned by Joaquin's uncle, and important for that reason, and the ominous manor house in the hills. There's a section called The Investigators Draw Attention, which is basically just about how unhelpful the sheriff is. And then there's the investigation. So this goes through the locations previously mentioned. At the speakeasy, you can meet the local disheveled drunk who spills clues about the barn where sacrifices happen. Go to the library, do some classic Call of Cthulhu library use rolls and find out mysterious and sinister things that happened around the town. And at the church, you meet Father Alonso, who is a weirdly abstracted fellow who is just, not entirely all there, admits to having been in touch with David Lane, but is not very helpful. But crucially, there's also a weird statue upstairs in the church tower. All the Catholics who live in the town never go to mass here, which is weird. They deliberately travel to another town to go to church. So that's a clue. Then there is the obelisk. If you follow the direction the statue in the church is pointing, or the directions in the drunken ramblings from the speakeasy, you'll find this, and here you'll find evidence that Joaquin's kidnapper was here, as were David Lane and Professor Godfrey. And this is a possible end location for the scenario. You can have your denouement here, potentially. But if you keep going in this direction, you'll find Shepherd's Barn. And underneath there, in a sort of hidden vault thing, is a sacrificial altar and physical remains. And also, as written, a servitor of the outer gods at the bottom of a ramp that will basically kill everyone if they go down there. So,
I love that part. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. I'm sorry. Yep.
No, it's okay. You can, okay, let's come back to it. But yeah, normally when I run it, I just delay that turning up. It's like you hear it coming, because otherwise it's just going to wipe out the whole party, which is a fine ending, but not necessarily the one you want. What else? There's also the Diaz family vault, not mentioned in the previous description, because you can discover it on your way to the Casa de Diaz, the big manor house mansion. I guess you don't have manor houses in America, but this is a kind of rock-side tomb with sarcophagi in it, mummified corpses, and one tomb still waiting for Bernardo Diaz, the head sorcerer. This could be an ending site, but I've never actually seen that happen. The other big finale location is the Casa de Diaz. This is the villain's hideout, big old house. You go in, look at the spooky things, and then down in the basement is his lab, and you can have a big showdown there. And there's also a possible coda if you defeat Bernardo Diaz and put on his magic ring, which is that this toad-like spirit Puddock shows up and talks to the PC who put it on to begin the process of turning them into an evil wizard over the course of the centuries that follow.
Indeed, the ending we got when you ran it for us at Gauntlet Con, right?
Well, yeah, I deliberately threw it in at the end because I liked it so much.
We didn't even earn it, did we?
Well, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I can't remember, really.
Let's talk about things we liked. I will say, big picture, I really, really love The Secret of Castronegro. It's a very, very fun module. One of the things I dig about it is the setting. It is in New Mexico. It's a bunch of devil worshippers, essentially, a family, a cult steeped in deviltry out in the desert. And that has a huge appeal to me personally. I have always loved the motif of Satanists, devil worshippers, cultists in the desert. And there are reasons for that. And I'm going to go into it real quickly. So this is kind of a personal thing, so just bear with me for a minute. When I was 5 years old, I think, my family moved to California, and we convoyed over to California from Texas with an aunt and uncle. So we had like a couple of cars, and we had the U-Haul truck and all that, and we're all kind of driving through the Southwest to get to California, right? And you have to cross through New Mexico. While going through New Mexico, it was late at night. My mom was driving the car that I was in, and my uncle's wife was driving the car ahead of us. As we're going along, it's just the only people in the car who are awake in my car that I'm in is me and my mother. And we see standing out on the side of the road in the New Mexico desert, out in the middle of fucking nowhere, a man in a robe and a hood, like a hooded robe, right? Like a cultist robe. And just standing there, like just ominously, right? And
wow.
Yeah, it was super freaky, right? And it didn't quite register to me like how scary it was at the time, but my mom was clearly bugged by it. And then, so shortly after that, they pulled off to a gas station, right? They pulled off to like go get gas, and my uncle's wife and my mom are both like freaking out because they both saw it too, right? They were like freaking out, like, oh my God, I wanted to speed up. I was like so scared something was going to happen, you know? It was just straight out of a horror movie, right?
Like I said, this definitely sounds like the beginning of a Weird Tales story.
Oh yeah, oh I know, yeah. We were like 2 steps away from like a terrible horror movie, right? I have, for whatever reason, that has always stuck with me. And you notice this. This is a motif that kind of runs through pop culture. Not a huge one, right? It's not a huge thing, but it's something that kind of like occurs every now and then. Like you think about that very popular podcast, Welcome to Night Vale, which is, a sort of like creepy, cult infused supernatural town in the middle of the desert. A couple of other things I'm going to talk about during Companion Adventures have this same idea. I just love that. And I love that The Secret of Castronegro does this too. In particular, I love that it's a Lovecraftian thing that's not in New England. I think that's also really, really nice about it. Another thing I'm very fond of as far as this scenario goes, and kind of piggybacking on my first point, this module has a really terrific sense of history and presence. I wouldn't say you get a huge in-depth, record of the town of Castronegro. I mean, the module itself is only 8 pages or something. It's not very long. And yet, the little cross-cut that we get, it really, really grounds it. It makes it feel like a real place that has existed. And there are tons of little touches throughout the module that really, really resonate and make it feel substantial. And so this stuck out to me while we were playing at GauntletCon and also when I was reading it again. But I remember this particular detail when we were playing of there's this occult shop, the Tomb, in this town that has fewer than 600 people in it. And I remember saying at GauntletCon, why would this town have such a shop?
Yeah. But the text has foreseen this, and I think in at least 2 places.
It does, yeah. The text acknowledges it, right? Yeah. And I didn't know that when we were playing, but then I look and I read the text. The text totally acknowledges it. It's like it's kind of strange that there'd be a shop like this. And indeed, if you ask the shopkeeper, how are you able to how is your business able to survive in this small town out in the middle of nowhere? He says something like, "Oh, we do a brisk mail order business."
Yeah, right? Yeah. And I think if in the hotel, the hotelier mentions the shop and brings up, apropos nothing in particular, that it's weird that it survives in this small town.
Yeah. I love this detail because I love this detail, and I love the fact that the author foreseen it because it has this sort of, this excuse that, we do a brisk mail order business. You can just imagine that scene in the horror movie version of this, right? Where some, punk kid from out of town asks, the shopkeeper, how are you able to keep this place open? And he says, I do a brisk mail order business. It's just believable enough for you not to ask any further questions, but also will leave you somewhat unnerved still, right? It's just slightly unbelievable.
Could be very Lynchian depending on how you play it as well. Just a nice smile. Oh, we do a brisk mail order business. And then that's it.
Yeah, exactly right. The module is just stuffed with little things like that. The authors, there's a loving care taken in these, 8, 10, whatever it is, pages. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Tom?
I really agree. I really felt like the town of Castronegro, I don't know that it feels really alive that much when you're reading it, because it is quite obviously broken into, this is the location where you get this clue and that. But in play, it just all those little notes that seem extraneous at the time. I mean, as you say, a player will volunteer. Doesn't it seem odd that this? And you're like, oh, right, that's why that note is there. Okay, that's good.
Right, yeah.
And and as you say, the cross-section of things like when you go to the library, all these stories that don't quite add up to a coherent narrative. They're just like little episodes in some kind of horrific backstory. And that is one of the things that I really like about it, is that it never spells out in the text to the GM what happened. It just gives you all the information, but it never tells you. It doesn't have an intro bit where it says, 5 days ago, this happened to him, and then they dragged him down here, and here's the timeline. It just has this quite simple clues, footprints in the flower bed, and here's some broken glasses. And it's a pretty high-risk strategy, because if you messed up your editing and left something out, you'd be pretty high and dry, but it really pays off.
Yeah, I agree completely, yeah. What else did you like about it, Tom?
Well, the other thing I like about it is, in particular, there is a recurring motif of is it the Diaz family that have the sparkling green eyes? I think it is, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yes. Sparkling green eyes. Now, when I was a kid, I read this in the 3rd edition Call of Cthulhu book. I got secondhand hardback version, and it was in there. And I think they've all got sparkling green eyes. That is lame. That's what young me was an idiot, okay? Because it is brilliant. It's an instant tie-in to the idea of family connections that runs through the scenario. There's loads of little references to so-and-so, this guy looked like he might have Indian blood. Now, in fact, people with Indian blood don't really are not involved in the main plot. But it's this idea of blood ties and ancestry that comes up.
Yep.
It gives the players something to look out for when they're going around. Oh, that guy's got green eyes. He might be related. But it's also not foolproof. It's not like a baddie detector, because they came here possibly looking for evidence about what happened to Joaquin. They know he's in the family. So they know that it's not a case of sparkling green eyes equals evil. And they also learn quickly that there are potential bad guys around who don't have this sign. And therefore they're constantly... It's like a sometimes reliable but not really very useful tool for spotting who's involved.
Yeah, I think that's what's one of the things that's really, really brilliant about this module. And I think it's something we're going to talk about a little later in the Expert Delve. But just to kind of throw it out there now, the book makes terrific use of visual motifs, of themes. It echoes its references throughout, like the little statues that you can find in different parts of the town. And oftentimes there's no like really apparent answer, like why we are meant to be focusing on this. You know, the little statuettes, for example, I don't think they ever explain that in the whole thing, but you find them in several places. And what it does is it lends this, it's almost not a subliminal clue, but it's like a sort of, it's just something that pings the player's brain, right? And I had that experience indeed when I was playing it. And it gets, like you said, it gets you thinking about these things. You get thinking about hereditary connections. You get thinking about ancient, magic and lost, like kind of dark things, right? Like in the tomb, you find, which is the bookstore, or not the bookstore, the little occult shop, you find like numerous little objects and things which you can investigate, and they have their own little gruesome descriptions and ghoulishness about them, but they don't necessarily link up to anything, right? They're there just to kind of get you in the headspace.
Yeah. And the other thing that I like is, as you alluded to earlier, is that the setting of rural New Mexico feels like it's important. And I think so the headspace you're in feels a certain way because it's in this little town in New Mexico, because you arrive by bus and not by train or in your own car. There's this certain sense of isolation, and it makes use of the setting in a way where I think if you moved this, okay, maybe you could move it back to the 1890s-ish, but if you set it anywhere else or a different time, it would lose something. It would really be different. And that's quite often you get setting changes that are just cosmetic. It's like, we're investigating mysteries, but we're in Burma in the 50s. I mean, it just doesn't really matter. But this one, it really plays on the colonial history of New Mexico and the physical characteristics of the setting, as well as having that general Lovecraftian mystery.
Yeah, agreed 100%. So what about questions? I have one. Mm-hmm. What's your feeling about all of the Lovecraft references in the text? I couldn't decide if I thought this was cheesy or not, because there are a couple of instances where it's real, like the Armitage Hotel is the name of the hotel, right? There's a character named Charles Dexter. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's definitely cheesy. There's no real debate about that. I mean, what I would say is it's authentic, because Lovecraft used to drop in lame gags about his mates into his stories, like the sorcerer, he's named after Clark Ashton Smith, and his name is like Clark Ashton or something like that. And so on that level, I guess it's banging genre. But I think actually one thing I would say in its defense is these jokes are they're only in the sort of first half of the scenario before you get to the town. And I sort of wonder is it like bait? So the players sort of get it out of their systems early on, and then when they arrive in the scary part, then they've kind of stopped doing the gags.
I think you're right. Yeah, that actually does make a lot of sense, because it's a pretty gnarly module. It gets really intense and horrific as it goes. And so, yeah, maybe it is a sort of like, haha, get this out of your system, kind of thing. Yeah, in that case, I guess I can kind of go with it. On paper, it seems really cheesy.
Yeah, especially Charles Dexter was the one that I just thought, oh, really?
I mean, like you hear my eyes rolling when I read it. I was like, oh my God.
So here's a question for you, though. This is about when you get to the town. Now, obviously, that documentary I saw about life in America, Escape from New York, made it look quite intense. But is it like really normal to be shot at when you're visiting a strange town?
We should unpack this. In the module, there is a strange detail where every day you spend in the town, on average, someone will someone at a distance will take a shot at you, like with a rifle.
Yeah,
right?
like with a rifle. And if you complain to the sheriff, he's not really interested in your whining, which I thought was quite...
Unless you get hit. Interestingly, if you get hit, he will initiate an investigation. But like, if you've managed to dodge the bullets, he doesn't care.
Oh, that's interesting. And it's, yeah, the weird thing for me, though, is that the text seems to assume that after you've been shot at, you'll just go about your business, which is unlikely to me. It's just, like, the town is menacing enough anyway. I don't think you really need this kind of physical threat, and you have the sort of like the nighttime visitations. So this is something I normally cut out of it when I've run it. And the same with the guard dogs at the big mansion. Like, you're getting to the scary showdown with the sorcerer. You don't really need to fight a couple of big dogs.
Oh, but the dogs have green eyes though, and they have green eyes and a vaguely human look. Why would you cut them? They're so great.
That's a good point, actually. Okay, maybe I take that back. Maybe the dogs are okay. But the rifle shots, normally not. But one time I ran it, I did include it, and it really changed how the game came out. It sort of turned into this sort of like neo-Western in the style of Last Man Standing or El Mariachi, where the guys are kind of creeping around these houses and always kind of keeping an eye out and then scurrying into doorways and stuff like that, which was fun, but not really maybe what we'd all signed up for. So, you know.
Well, so to answer the joking part of your question, no, it is not a feature of American culture whereby if you arrive in a new town and someone is taking sniper shots at you, you continue your investigation. I actually think this is a super weird detail. When I read it, I thought it was really strange. And when you ran it for us, that was not a thing that happened in the game, right? So I was encountering it for the first time on the page there. I actually really like it, and having thought about it, I really like it, and here's why. It reminded me of a very particular flavor of genre horror or horror genre movie that was somewhat popular in the 1970s, which was horror that was kind of mundane. Like, it wasn't supernatural horror. It wasn't, anything like dark and magical or anything like that. And it wasn't like a crazed serial killer. It was a Vietnam vet returned from the war who's gone crazy and is now like shooting people, right? Like, as in the 1968 film Targets. It reminded me of one of Steven Spielberg's very first films, which is a really intense, good horror movie, but the horror is not like a killer. It's this road rage incident. I can't remember the name of the movie. Oh, Duel. Duel's the name of the movie.
Yeah, with Dennis Weaver. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah.
Really good.
In Duel, I think it had some other names too. I don't think it actually released as Duel. It was called something else when it first came out. But in any case, the terror of that movie is it's a road rage incident where he like cuts off a trucker or something, and now the trucker is like harassing him. Yeah. Like harassing him, like on the road, and kind of stalking him. There was this strain of horror movies in the 70s, especially, that kind of focused on the mundane and focused on things that are particularly tied to American culture. Big, giant trucks, guns, that kind of thing. And so in that sense, it had echoes of that for me. I don't know if that's what the authors intended, but it definitely felt like that.
That's true. Yeah, it's got a bit of the sort of straw dogs thing about, I guess it's not American, but yeah, but yeah, I suppose the thing for me is I think this would be a bit of a distraction. Like, you could have a good game of Secret of Castronegro, like in just D&D, OSR, a bit more actiony, but you'd want maybe 3 or 4 sessions to go kind of find out who's shooting at you from the hills and kind of fight dogs in the garden of the mansion.
Fight green-eyed human-faced dogs, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. I suppose actually that's true. It's Cthulhu Darkable if you got a 2-session run, maybe, because then you can afford the time and space to go and have that side scene.
Right, yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one actually, which is a question I had when I was prepping to run it last time. I'd never really noticed before. And I think I know the answer, so I thought I'd informatively tell everyone what I figured out, which is, why does the newspaper story mention Las Cruces and not Castronegro or wherever else as a destination? And I believe this is because that's where you change trains to get to Silver City.
Very clever. Wow, that's a pretty good investigation there. Yeah.
I actually looked up train maps from the 1920s to double check.
This is the level of dedication you get on Fear of a Black Dragon, listeners. Just know that.
Yeah.
Let's do the chain lightning round. I'll start. There is a reference in the text to the, quote, sendings of Bernardo Diaz. And what this is at a certain point, Bernardo Diaz, the sort of big bad sorcerer, he will send like occult visions and sorcelments on the party, right? And it actually leads to a nice little scary sequence where you sort of see these like strange, squat, green-eyed creatures out of the corner of your eye, right? Doing horrifying things. But I kind of just love referring to his magical invasions as sendings. I really love that. I'm stealing that word.
Yeah. I'm a fan of the toad-like spirit from the bad ending, because he's called Puddock, and that's a nod to historically attested names that people gave to witches' familiars. One of the witches in Macbeth has a familiar called Paddock, so I think that's quite a nice, I was going to say grounding in reality, but maybe not necessarily reality, but there or thereabouts.
In the Casa de Diaz, you can find a picture, or a painting rather, of Bernardo Diaz, which depicts his rat familiar whispering into his ear, which is a little unnerving if you just think about it for a minute.
I also like the recurring creepy little statuettes that show up in sinister places, and as mentioned, you feel like they must mean something, but the meaning is always just out of reach, and it recalls for me some of the things that John Tynes, noted Call of Cthulhu author, wrote about many years ago now, this idea of a hazy system in ghost stories where you feel like if you knew just one more thing, you could make sense of it all, but of course you're never going to get that one more thing.
The most horrifying, jaw-dropping part of the entire module, in my opinion, happens in the last paragraph of it, where we are told that if you go into the catacombs beneath the Casa de Diaz, you encounter thousands of passages and tunnels, and upwards of 300 cannibal imbeciles. That is horrifying. Let's go to the Expert Delve.
Okay, so we've covered things that we like about the scenario, and I would like to try and figure out why is it good.
All right. What's our jumping off point here?
Well, so, I think we probably don't need to rehearse the bits we like about it, but I want to compare it to another scenario that also appeared in the Cthulhu Companion, which is very similar, but isn't anywhere near as successful as a design. It's also a slightly sandboxy thing where you go to an isolated town, this time in Scotland, and there's a clan of baddies there who worship an evil god and have been doing sacrifices. It's called The Mystery of Loch Fen. Anyway, it's still an okay adventure, like my only good and completed game on Storium used it. It was a really good outcome. Remember that? Storium?
Vaguely, yeah. Yes. I remember it was a thing that kickstarted and that people played for 10 minutes, yes.
Yep, that was the one. Anyway, so I think it's comparing and contrasting is a valuable thing. So, Secret of Castronegro, for example, never tells you what happened to the victims. Loch Fen never tells you at all. There are no clues. Like, one of the players in my game said, so what was the cause of death on this guy? And I was like, it doesn't say. So basic preparatory work. I would say also, Castronegro makes very effective use of recurring motifs, whereas Loch Fen is kind of a grab bag. There's a spooky castle, and you can investigate its basement, and then there's a sort of evil magic mirror that will summon some kind of spawn of something or other if you look at it for too long. But then that's not really related to the monsters that are living in the lake that are basically Loch Ness monsters, but with magnets. It's just like kind of all a bit thrown together and doesn't quite work. And then I think the other big thing is that, as we've discussed, Castronegro feels like a real-ish place with groups of people who interact and live there, whereas Loch Fen is a collection of locations. There's a farmhouse and the castle and a town that exists mainly just to go and buy shotgun ammunition. And it's not coherent, and it doesn't have kind of recurring elements. And I think that is a big deal. And recurring elements are also a good way for you to glue together your scenario when you're running it. It sort of gives you something to fall back on and return to.
Yeah, I'd like to just kind of insert really quickly. I think you're right about the way that Castronegro repeats visual motifs, the way it deals with themes. I think there's actually like a really helpful lesson there in like running a game too, right? If you were preparing your own scenario, like if you were writing, for example, a scenario for Cthulhu Dark or something like that, that is a great way to do it, right? That's a great sort of themes and motifs are a great thing to hang everything on top of, right? I practice this really actively in my gaming. So we've talked about it a little bit on this show before, but my painting the scene technique, right? It's all about theme and visual motif, right? Theme and or visual motif. It's about interrogating the players around ideas of different themes and different concerns that we have. And then using that to sort of like to bind it all together, right? So like when I prep a game, when I'm writing an adventure, even when I'm just like going through a pre-made adventure, I focus on the themes. I prep for theme. I don't prep for plot, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that, I mean, I'm going to talk about something quite technical coming off of this. And what I want to be clear about is you don't need to be kind of thinking about this in a mechanical, if X then Y way. You just need to sort of have preloaded your brain with what's this scenario about. One thing I've done in the past, especially which is good for pulpy adventures, is just to write down a series of images and ideas. I was sort of inspired to do this by what's his name? Michael Moorcock's apparent method for writing fantasy stories. He just scribbles down loads of ideas like screaming demon statues, and he just tries to get to that scene wherever he was starting from. So yeah, you like write down a bunch of words on a bit of paper and just don't even look at it later. But having written that stuff down, that will come to you, and that follows the sort of the improv maxim of be obvious. Like, don't kind of sit there going, oh, what should I do now? Well, it'd be interesting if there were 2 orcs in the room. I was like, no, just do the first thing you thought of, and that's right, going to be fine. And a classic method to prep this kind of thing is to have random encounter tables, right? They're designed so that some things are more common than others, and so that different regions that people visit or different stages of the adventure have different random stuff happening. But you can also kind of cut to other scenes. I know you like a cutscene, Jason.
I do,
or have flashbacks that are inspired by your awareness of the themes going on at work. I bet you're wondering, do I have an example?
If you don't, I do.
Okay, do you want to do one? And then we can talk about Castronegro specifically.
So for right now, we have that Dungeon World actual play series that's going on right now. We Hunt the Keepers. And spoiler alert, massive spoiler alert for anybody who's following that. The whole campaign is basically the player characters being manipulated by this spider goddess, right? They are pawns stuck on her grand web, right? But we didn't reach that sort of conclusion. That was an emergent detail that came out. We didn't reach that emergent detail until we had established like spiders as a sort of motif of the story, right? And if you listen really closely to these APs, you see it. Sometimes it's just in small ways, but spiders keep appearing, right? Like spiders, they appear connected to NPCs, symbols in dungeons related to spiders. Like it comes up over and over again, and it ends up being this like really, really like interesting, grand, unifying theme that also like plays into the ultimate story, and it all just kind of works really great as a result. So that was just kind of sticking around. That was just kind of like in my brain while you were talking there, Tom. What's your sort of Castronegro specific stuff? Well,
the Castronegro example made me realize something that oddly ties into film editing theory. Let me tell you
a bit about... in, listeners.
Strap in, everyone. Yeah. Okay, so when I ran Secret of Castronegro in Gauntlet Con, you had your investigator go upstairs into the church tower and do something that is not covered in the text. Namely, you touched the statue.
I touched the statue, yep.
And then what happened?
When I touched the statue, I think I got an insight roll from that, which in Cthulhu Dark means you're going to have like a flash of dark insight, right? And then I think you gave me like a vision. You kind of showed me some stuff that was going on in other parts of the module, right?
Yeah, a little bit. Like I gave you certain knowledge, but I also asked you a flashback question. And what happened there was I was thinking, well, maybe nothing happens. And I thought, well, that's kind of lame. I mean, it's a big creepy statue. Probably something should happen. So I thought, well, what's this? What are the 2 main themes in Castronegro? Well, families and death. So I went for the death one. And I asked you, what was the, I think first time or last time, either way, that you touched a dead body.
Oh, that's right. I remember this.
And so then you gave me the answer.
Yeah. What was the first? Yes, you did. You were like, when was the first time you touched a dead body? I thought that was really great. Yeah.
And so my time was that you gave me a bit of a story about, I think, your character's uncle. I talked about how cold it was and that the statue was cold like that. But in hindsight, I realized it's cold like that. That's really lame and kind of on the nose, because I didn't need to say that. I didn't need to give you that link, right? That's kind of obvious. And this is where the montage theory comes in, right? So back in the 1910s and 20s, when films were first invented, it took people a while to figure out editing, okay? Massive racist D.W. Griffith was the pioneer of something called continuity editing, which is what we still see in Hollywood mostly today. You know, all the shots kind of follow on sequentially from each other. There's not too much jumping from one place to another. But meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, a guy called Lev Kuleshov had done some experiments with sticking footage of a famous actor from the Imperial era with, I think it was a picture of a baby, a picture of some soup, well, a shot of some soup, and I think of a young girl. And basically the test audience said, wow, his acting's so great. You can really see the hunger in his eyes when he looks at the soup. And he looks really sort of warm-hearted when he looks at the baby. And the thing is, what they didn't know was it was the exact same footage of the actor, just with a different different shots. And that got developed by guys like Sergei Eisenstein and V.I. Podovkin into the montage theory, the uppermost tier of which is intellectual montage. So you combine shots to create a meaning that separately they don't have. So, for example, in Strike, Eisenstein's film about a strike, hence the name, you see these workers being attacked by the cops, then you see a bull being slaughtered. The meaning of the two things separately is straightforward, but the meaning when they're combined is that the workers are being treated like cattle. Pretty obvious stuff. But you can do that in role-playing games because just by putting different scenes next to each other, you create contrast between them or complementary actions. And that actually is something that GMs and players do all the time, I think, without thinking about it very much.
So what you're saying is, in the example you gave of in that Gauntlet Con game, when I touched the statue and you asked me, tell me about the first time you saw a dead person or whatever it was, or touched a dead person. And then I would just like say it. And then you would just say nothing, and we would just infer that that's what you meant? Kind
of, right. So like I would say something like, it's really cold. Maybe I'd give you the other bit of the information, and then I would ask you for the flashback, and then we would just move on. I don't need to say, it's like this.
Yeah.
You can just, you can infer that that's the connection. And actually, I did pull it off once in a World of Dungeons game where, for reasons we don't need to go into, someone was being magically saved from death, but to do so had to enter a bargain with the King of the Sharks. And so the whole kind of vision sequence was a bit like drowning. So my question was, tell me about a time you nearly drowned. And, she gave me an answer about that. And I think I refrained from mentioning it. I just that was what the sensation was like.
You know, I think this probably connects up with what you're saying a little bit, although I wouldn't say I've ever thought about it in terms, like in film editing theory terms, for sure.
Strangely.
But, whenever I pose a question, what I call a painting the scene question, whenever I pose a question to a player, you're in the chateau of the Medusa noble. Tell me what you see that lets you know that this place is owned by a Medusa or whatever, right? Like just some weird little detail question like that. I find that it's the asking of the question that's powerful, right? It's the process that the player goes through as they think about the possibilities and the ramifications that is the power of it, right? It's not even the answer. It's the procedure, right? It's the doing of that. It's the sparking this thought, sparking this process. I think that's why it's a really powerful player engagement tool.
Yeah. And it's worth seeing as well the difference between the film theory, where it's just the director and the editor deciding what the content and length of any component is, and when we're playing a game where everyone is combining shots, I suppose, all the time. I, the GM, describe a room. You tell me what you're doing. You might walk out of it. The whole group is constantly creating montage. And so the best way to kind of use that is to, just steep yourself in the most important things about the game you want to run. Don't even think about it as like, today I'd like to interrogate the Marxist dialectic on class. Like, it's just sort of, darkness and spiders in this dungeon. That's great. And it sort of builds up as well then with recurring elements, because I'd like to ask you about an NPC that I know you use quite a lot in long-running series Mercy Falls, which is Big Man. Now, can you tell us a bit about Big Man and what he does?
Sure. So Big Man is a sort of Lovecraftian figure in my long-running Monster Hearts campaign, Mercy Falls. He's he's basically a sort of study in like contrasts. That's the whole idea about Big Man when I was characterizing him. He is called Big Man because he's physically imposing. He's described as being nearly 7 feet tall with his cowboy hat, right? But he wears this very feminine, dusty yellow colored suit. And he talks with a really, really like strange, whistly, high pitched voice, which doesn't match his physical imposingness, right? And also, he just kind of like appears places. He is big and imposing, but you kind of never see him coming also. He's incredibly magically stealthy. And his function in the story is mostly just to show up and say cryptic things, which kind of get the players thinking about cryptic things. And then he bails.
Yeah, exactly. I've used Big Man as well. And he did exactly the same kind of stuff. He's a fun character to do. I think it's important that he wears a cowboy hat, doesn't he? A 10-gallon hat?
He does indeed.
Yeah, I think that's, because there's something about that in the way that the fact that he's a recurring character is important as well. Because if it was a different kind of weird gnomic figure every time, it wouldn't be as powerful. Because it's built a reputation amongst the players, so that when he turns up again, they know something weird's going to happen, something probably important, or just something cryptic. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. It's a definite thing. Well, and also because those are like public games, which, you know, a lot of people listen to via podcasts and other things. New players into the series also know Big Man, right? So like he's particularly powerful as a tool, as a device for invoking a certain emotional response. But you can do this in your games too, right? And I think that's what you're going to allude to here.
Yeah. So I should mention why I think the cowboy hat is important, because he predates the settlement of Mercy Forks, right? But he's wearing the wrong, basically all of his clothes are out of time. So he's something that's unnatural, but is apparently part of the earth. And that's weird. So I think the best thing about it is, how did you create Big Man? Did you sort of sit down and go, I want to study in contrast who's going to be like a symbol of weirdness and ancient secrets, or what?
No, I did not. It turned out that way, but that is not where he came from. I was actually standing on the shoulders of giants with Big Man. Big Man was directly inspired by the villain in the Coen brothers movie Blood Simple.
Oh yeah,
the sort of hitman villain, from the way he talks to the basic way he looks. He was inspired by that. But what ended up happening was I took that sort of Coen brothers inspired character, sort of amped him up by a couple of orders of bigness and scariness, right? And then dropped him in. He definitely came about because I was, I wouldn't say I just sat down and wrote him that way, or like you said, I didn't say, I want him to be a study in contrast. It wasn't that. I think it was mostly just a matter of like trying to create a character that pings the players in a way that is just a little bit off, and who feels, it was important to me that he felt like eternal or ever present, ancient, right? That was a really important part of it.
Yeah. And I think so. That sounds like the process I kind of have in mind, that you have an image of something that sparks a reaction in you, and then you do what feels right while you're thinking about the game you want to play. And that is how you get to thematically good, improvised, or, in this case, planned, but spontaneous generation of content for your game.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, so what else do we want to say about this? I don't even know if this topic has a title. It's been so interesting, but it's gone in a lot of different directions. Is there anything that you want to say about it?
No, I think that's pretty much covered it. I guess it's just this idea of, to sum up, the reason it kind of came up is because, you often have sort of RPG advice columns or just entire sections of modules worried about what's going to happen if you stray off the part covered by the text or by your prep. But I think the only way to account for that is not to have an elaborate set of backup plans, but to get your headspace fixed so that whatever comes to mind or the question you think to ask is going to just fit. And the fact it doesn't need to be creative, it doesn't need to be genius. In fact, trying to do that will be counterproductive, because you only need to come up with an obvious question and the players will sort that out for you.
That's absolutely true. And if you do feel the need to have more of a grip on it yourself as the GM, if you don't feel super comfortable like letting the players kind of like help you fill that fiction in, I would refer you to the last episode of the Gauntlet podcast. It's called, it is rather pretentiously named GM Masterclass 01.
Wow.
Where I talk about my 7-3-1 short prep technique. I love this technique. I've talked about it in other places, and I go into it in quite some detail on that episode. But what's great about it and why I find it super useful as a GM, is you end up with a coherent set of elements that feel consistent with your world and that you can kind of pull and use in any place you wish. And it leads to a setting that feels honest. And that honesty comes from part of the 7-through-1 process is thinking about visual and thematic things that bind the world together. Let's go to companion adventures. Hello. I have 2 very important things to share with you. The first, after a long wait, Codex back issues are now available on Drive-Thru-RPG, so if you joined our Patreon late and missed some of the earlier issues, you can now round out your collection. The second, the newest issue of Codex, Codex Cold, is available in our Patreon feed through March 2018. Here's what you'll find inside. Firelight, an original powered by the Apocalypse game and Game Chef 2017 finalist. The Wreck of the Void Hatred, a chilling OSR scenario. Balia, which I may not be pronouncing correctly, but is in any case a rural town in Ireland for Monster Hearts 2. Our newest Gauntlet daddy, Cold Cock. 5 dozen unusual things about the body we just found, a number of original illustrations, and a custom layout by Ollie Jeffrey. To get Codex Cold, just make a $4 or higher pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon by March 31st. That's at patreon.com/Gauntlet. And do check Drive-Thru-RPG for the Codex back issues. Thank you. It's the Companion Adventures. Tom, what's your music selection?
Music, okay. A couple of songs by the fingerstyle guitarist John Fahey. They're both from his album The Dance of Death and Other Plantation Favorites. So Dance of Death, the title track, that would be one potential theme tune for the Secret of Castronegro, and the other is the first track on that album, Wine and Roses. It's kind of primitive Americana, one might call it.
Yeah, no, it's a good track. I only have one selection for companion adventures. Actually, I have like dozens, but I was like having a difficult time like narrowing it down or trying to find something that made any of them particularly relevant. But I really think when I read The Secret of Castronegro, I think a lot of 1970s horror. I think of grindhouse exploitation type horror, particularly that cannibal bit at the end. I think of films that star Mary Woronov, some Roger Corman films, like that kind of thing. And I was having a hard time, like, kind of like deciding what is the ultimate one here. Ultimately, I chose to go with a bit of a weird selection. It's actually a 2009 film called The House of the Devil by Ty West. The director is Ty West. I love this movie. Many people do not like this movie because they don't consider it a real horror movie, but those people are full of shit. It is such a good movie. It's so tense and so scary. And the reason why I've chosen it is because the two villains, or the two principal villains, are these Satanists, and Mary Woronov plays one of them, and she says this line, which I love. It's such a good line, the way she delivers it. She says, "We're from the desert, you know." And I was immediately transformed. I was transported back to this idea of like cultists in a desert location, and not super closely tied to the Secret of Castronegro, except one can imagine the villains in House of the Devil maybe being people who escaped Castronegro or who are leaving Castronegro to spread the good word of Puddock.
Yeah. So, well, my film selection is kind of, where you've covered the devil worshipping in the desert section. I've got, I think it's the archetypal stranger turning up into a town with a secret, and not everyone in the town is, part of the secret, but it's still pretty bad. And that is Bad Day at Black Rock, starring Spencer Tracy in 1955. He's a war veteran who comes to find his Japanese-American friend, or actually I forget the exact relationship, but the point is that said friend has disappeared and turns out to be mysteriously dead for reasons that Spencer Tracy investigates. And then also for the setting, that sort of, there's lots of kind of roadside gas stations and little towns that aren't quite ghost towns, but almost might as well be in the desert, which turns up in this series a lot. And that's The Invaders from 1967 and 68. It's like a Cold War paranoia thing where these this one guy who's always described in the opening credits as an architect, which I don't think is ever important, but is architect David something. And he is trying to warn people about this alien invasion. And the thing with the aliens is, much like the green eyes, which are an unreliable indicator of diasness in Castronegro, the aliens have a thing where they only have 4 fingers in their native form. So sometimes their little fingers stick up in the air when they're holding stuff or doing things. Nice. And there's a great moment and this is a spoiler for the first episode, which came out in 1967, so I feel like I'm on okay ground here, where he's waiting for someone to come along who can help him out with, the alien problem in this town, in a kind of deserted diner after dark with this woman who lives in the town and has been helping him out. And he gets annoyed with her because I think she turns on the jukebox and saying, I was listening for the so-and-so arriving. And she goes up to him and says, don't spend your life listening for cars that will never come, looking for faces that you'll never see. And then he sort of takes her hand and starts to look at her fingers, right? And she says, well, fingers? We're not all like that, David. And that's just this, oh my God, moment that you realize he's screwed. So anyway, The Invaders, it's very 60s mainstream TV, so don't expect stylistic amazingness, but it's pretty effective paranoia in the American Western deserts. So it works on that front.
Awesome. Listeners, that's our show. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can go to the community section of G+ and search for The Gauntlet. You will find us there. We are on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. Tom and I are also both, my Twitter is at Gauntlet RPG, and Tom is also on Twitter as well. I think his name comes up if you just search for it. We have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/Gauntlet, and our website is gauntlet-rpg.com. Tom, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you, Jason.
Thanks, listeners. Take care.